So I'm going to talk about the election. I'll talk about both the candidates, but really I'm only going to talk about one candidate because the second candidate, Mr. Joe Biden, you could really describe in one sentence. He is a standard, mainstream, democratic, centrist, self-interested politician. He is Walter Mondale. He is Herbert Humphreys. He is Bill Clinton, or maybe he's slightly better than Bill Clinton. He's really just a regular old white politician. He is what you see when you Google politician or look it up in the dictionary. I don't like that. I don't think he's. I don't like him. I actually spent months trying to make sure that we were not in this circumstance. If America only would have listened. But this is where we're at. He's also not a Marxist or an anarchist or a fascist or a satanic pedophile, as some corners of the dark web seem to claim. He's just a regular old politician. That's what he's always been, except for when he was a regular medium-aged, middle-aged politician. That's all he is. The person I really want to talk about is Donald Trump, who is somebody that a depressingly large percentage of people within my orbit, as well as just in America in general, are supportive of. And they might say that he's not perfect, he's a little rough around the edges, but he's been trying his best to make America great again, and the proof is in the pudding. He's really done a great job with the country. And so I thought I'd jot down some notes on a few of the things that he's done over the past little bit, which are incontroversial, and then maybe we can evaluate his performance as a whole and whether we should support him again. And so I've compartmentalized Trump's administration into a half dozen different areas. The first is campaign promises, like were they done or not done? Well, if you remember back to 2015, 2016, the biggest part of his campaign was to build the wall. He was trying to build a wall. He actually wanted Mexico to pay for that wall along the Mexico border. And so that's about 2,000 miles long, the U.S.-Mexico border. Granted, there's some rivers and stuff, but there was a lot of wall to build, a lot of paying for Mexico to do. Did he build the wall? Well, as of September 18th, 2020, 331 miles of wall had been built under Trump. That's quite a bit of wall, not quite 2,000, but 331 miles. Of those, 9 miles had been built where no primary barriers existed before. So that's pretty impressive. So we've got 9 new miles of wall in 4 years. And so that's over 2 miles of wall per year. And so, at that rate, in, less than 1,000 years, we could cover the entire Mexico border in wall. So that's pretty impressive. That's probably me being unfair, because also 295 miles of wall had been built in place of old barriers that the government said were dilapidated and or out of date. 27 miles were new secondary wall to reinforce primary barriers. So that's interesting. Has Mexico paid for the wall? Usually I might try to say that in a witty, sarcastic way, but nope, they haven't paid for the wall. The wall hasn't been built, and the parts that have were not paid for by Mexico. They were taken from federal U.S. funds. The taxpayer has paid for the wall, the 9 miles of new wall, and the other reinforced barriers. And so another one of his promises was to reduce the debt and reduce the deficit. He's a Republican. He believes in small government. He doesn't spend money out the wazoo like these big government liberal Democrats over here. He's going to reduce the debt and deficit. He promised to eliminate the deficit actually within 8 years. How's the deficit doing? It's actually exploded throughout his time in office, primarily because he's increased military funding by another $150 billion. Just for reference, free public colleges around the United States would cost about $80 billion a year, and so we could have had that twice over just through the increase in the military budget, which was already over $600 billion when he came into office, and so he just threw another $150 billion at that, and then also further increased it by cutting taxes for the biggest corporations and the richest people, which further exploded the debt. And that led to, or rather the deficit, and that led to the debt increasing from $19.9 trillion to $27 trillion where it's at now. And so not quite what he said was going to happen. These next things are things that I didn't know which category to put in, but I think are still maybe relevant to talking about whether this is the person that's the best person in the country to be in control of the nuclear devices. If you remember back a year ago, there was a hurricane Hurricane Dorian, which was about to hit the East Coast and was about to hit Florida and Georgia. But Trump thought it was going to hit Alabama too, so he tweeted that out. And then the National Weather Service told him, sorry, it's actually not going to hit Alabama. And rather than telling that to the tens of thousands of people in Alabama who thought that they were about to be hit by a hurricane and probably need to evacuate and figure their stuff out, that they don't have anything to worry about, he thought it would probably be a better idea to save face, make sure that his original tweet maintains credibility, and so called a press conference, brought in a map of the hurricane's trajectory from the National Weather Service, and then drew with a Sharpie an increased path so that it looked like it was hitting Alabama. I don't know what you say about somebody with a character like that who would rather trick thousands of people into thinking that they're about to be hit by a hurricane and mislead them when he has the power of the entire eyes of the nation paying attention to his every word. Than to admit that he made an incorrect tweet. I think that's Trump in a nutshell. What else has he done? He spent $70,000 on hair preparation, which he uses tax deductions. The taxes which he's paid $750 in income tax for. The taxes which are extremely low for him and for other rich people and billionaires, in large part because the one major piece of legislation he pushed through was that tax bill, which exploded the debt and the deficit, as I talked about, but made sure that these type of loopholes continued and expanded. So $70,000 on hair preparation for television. There are many, many people working in mills and coal mines and doing manual labor around the country, which are big fans of Trump. And I wonder what they would do if they talked to somebody who has spent $70,000 on their hair in real life. Would they, think that he's the best person in the world to run the country, or would they think that this is the most ridiculous, narcissistic, elitist, out of touch person that they've ever met in their life? I think I know what they'd do in real life, but it's interesting that through the medium of television and propaganda, this has become the savior. He continues to maintain support from Christians and evangelicals in particular. I think he has about 80% evangelical support, despite being on his third marriage, despite having, paid tens of thousands of dollars to a porn star to keep quiet about his extramarital affair, despite being a billionaire and transparently a narcissist, and despite it being harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than it is for a camel to go through the eye of the needle, which is actually very hard because camels are much larger than needles. Doesn't really matter. For a very large amount of the country, right after Jesus, Trump is their favorite person, and Trump is actually doing God's work, doing Jesus's work here on earth for them. And so all that other stuff is kind of pushed to the side because he is, he's the kind of person that doesn't want, gays in California teaching our children that we came from monkeys. Like, that's really what God is concerned about. So he has all their support. The next one's called Corrupt Stuff. So he ran ads against Clinton at the end of 2016 when he was trying to drain the swamp. He was going to flesh out the corruption, and he attacked her for her ties to Goldman Sachs, which I think is justifiable because Goldman Sachs is they paid her tens of or hundreds of thousands of dollars to give short speeches. She had many ties to that bank and many other financial institutions, as well as corporate America in general, and he was going to stop all of that, and he was going to flesh it out. As soon as he's elected, who does he appoint as his chief economic advisor? Gary Cohn, head of Goldman Sachs, who is his Treasury Secretary to this date, Steve Mnuchin, high up in Goldman Sachs. And that's just two examples that were totally transparent because he went out of his way to attack Goldman Sachs like a week before he got elected, but his entire administration is packed with corporate hacks and tools who are looting the public funds in order to enrich themselves, but it doesn't really matter. How about his foreign policy? Well, one thing that he's went out of his way to do is maintain close relations with Saudi Arabia, because as he said while pointing to a giant poster at a press conference, they buy our weapons. Look at all these weapons they buy. They spend hundreds of millions of dollars on this and billions of dollars on that. So we got to keep ties with them for that. Plus, they sell us oil. And he's more or less said this explicitly. And so we have to maintain close connections with them. This is just good business. America first, as he said. And so if they, chop up a journalist, this is something that we can, just look past. If they, behead people in mass beheadings, literally dozens of people at the same time, for crimes that include sorcery. They're literally beheaded for sorcery. And if you know anything about sorcery, you know that it doesn't exist. And so they're actually beheading innocent people. They're actually doing exactly what ISIS does. But these are our closest allies, and we keep giving them tons of weapons to use on people in Yemen and other places and their own population. And so this is the guy who is standing up to ISIS and standing up to radical Islam, when actually a lot of the funding and a lot of the ideological background comes from the Wahhabi, Salafist, Islamist ideology that the government of Saudi Arabia exports throughout the Middle East through madrasas and through their various connections to their neighbors. Doesn't really matter. We buy their oil, they buy our weapons. It's a great deal. 15 of the 19 hijackers come from that. Don't worry about it. They're still the good people. How is he done on race relations? Is America healing and growing? Are we benefiting from Trump's unifying presence in the White House? He's retweeting white power. He's talking about neo-Nazi rallies that literally kill people, and talking about the good people on both sides. He's telling white supremacists to stand back and stand by when asked if he'll criticize them. He's calling Mexicans criminals and rapists and murderers, and a couple good people too, despite immigrants committing less crime. And still, all of his supporters will say he's not dog whistling even a little bit. He's just talking cold hard facts. Fair enough, but all the racists actually tend to like him. I heard some comedian once say something about not all Trump supporters are racist, which is true, but all racists are Trump supporters, which is almost also true literally as well. And so the racists tend to think that he's racist, so why can't you see that too? Okay, what about healthcare? He said he was going to eliminate Obamacare. Fortunately, wasn't able to do that. The reason he wanted to do that, in my opinion, is because it had Obama in its name, and anything that says Obama has to go, because I'm Trump, I am better than Obama, and my ego says that if a few million people with pre-existing conditions lose their health care and die, or a large number of them die, that's just the price that we have to pay. Just like the people in Alabama, thinking that they're going to get hit by a hurricane is the price that they need to pay in order for my tweet to maintain credibility. He's announced he's going to cut Medicare and Social Security if he wins re-election, because that's what the fiscal conservatives who push for tax cuts and as well as cuts to things that benefit poor people have been trying to push through, despite promising that he was not going to cut those programs in 2016. Whoever knew healthcare could be so complicated, he once said. A lot of people actually knew that. How are prescription drug prices? Have they gone down during the Trump administration? I know people who don't buy prescription drugs and listen to him think that they have, because he says that he's done good things for it. They've actually gone up consistently. Same with healthcare prices in general. Healthcare is a disaster. So how do you do on COVID? Well, we have 220,000 deaths, which is 20% of the deaths in the world, despite having 4% of the world's population. Which isn't great. That would mean that we have 5 times as many deaths per capita as the rest of the world, despite having more money than any other country in the rest of the world. Those numbers would suggest that maybe our response wasn't the best in the world. Just for comparison, Germany has 9,500 deaths despite having 83 million people in their population. So that would be a little more than a quarter of our population, despite having about less than a 20th of the deaths. And so I'll let you do the math, but that's a comparable country in terms of GDP and per capita income. So I would say that wasn't a very good job. He stopped masks from being sent out by the Postal Service when they literally had a plan to do so at the beginning of the pandemic, and decided we're not going to do that because we don't want to scare people. Don't want to scare people into thinking that hundreds of thousands of them are going to die if precautions aren't taken, which is exactly what happened. He goes out of his way to call it the China virus and the Wuhan virus, and as well as not wear masks anytime that he can get it. And now he has coronavirus. And now that he's recovered from coronavirus, he says you just got to be tough and battle through it. As if the thing that determines whether people survive from coronavirus is mental fortitude and not biological factors and how the virus interacts with your immune system. But because he's, one of the whatever 98% of people who recover from it, that just shows how tough that he is. He had to be tough. And so in doing so, doubtless is going to further increase the spread of the virus as people, dismiss precautions that need to be taken in order to alleviate it. But he'll go out his way. He'll call it the China virus. So we need to sow some xenophobia. He needs to call it the Wuhan flu. The Spanish flu actually originated in Kansas. It's not called the Kansas flu. And if it was called the Kansas flu, it would actually be a stupid thing. Just like naming a virus for the location that it originated in is a stupid xenophobic thing, because this is the world. Viruses originating does not mean anything about the population of the country, which is arbitrary that location happens to be in. He said that one day the virus is just going to disappear. He says it's going to disappear one day like a miracle. So that's great news. In addition to injecting ourselves with bleach, the virus is going to disappear. He's also, he's great at a lot of things, but he's one of the nation's top scientists, which is why he contradicts the other top scientists, because he knows more than they do. And so it's going to disappear one day. I mean, the Spanish flu of 1917 is still circulating today, and it's been recombined and is actually the primary component of the flu that is the common flu today. So that's been over 100 years and it's still around, but Trump knows that this one's going to disappear like a miracle, and he let the people know it too. How about for the environment? Well, like I mentioned, he's one of the top scientists in America, and so he knows that the other climate scientists who've been studying specific ice core samples and geographic trends over millennia, and composition of the atmosphere and the relative heat trapping abilities of CO2 versus methane versus nitrous oxides and other greenhouse gases. They say that global warming is happening. It's almost completely universal. They say it's human caused. They say that it's accelerating, and they say that the damages and the consequences of inaction is going to be incalculable within just a couple of generations. But Trump, he's the top scientist. He knows that it's actually a plot by Chinese industrialists to make American manufacturing uncompetitive. And so it's a hoax. And so he's pulled out of the climate agreement, the Paris Climate Agreement. He puts Scott Pruitt and Andrew Wheeler as heads of the EPA, who are two more shills for the fossil fuel industry, or for industries in general, which comprise his administration and his cabinet, as I mentioned. He's privatized lands in Bears Ears and as other national monuments and public lands in general, so that corporations can get rich digging for minerals in land that the public used to own. He's repealed EPA CAFE standards to reduce car emissions, so that not only can our CO2 emissions continue to increase, but also poor people living in urban centers can continue to have increased respiratory issues. And really, any time that there's a chance to repeal regulation around keeping poison out of the air or water, that it's been repealed. And so that's what I think about him. I think he's a narcissist. I think he's an egomaniacal megalomaniac of the highest order. I think that I don't think that I've ever met anybody in real life as reprehensible as him. And I think that if anybody, if any even of his supporters, if they were to run into somebody that acted that way, to run into a billionaire born with a silver spoon in his mouth, never able to take responsibility for anything, always takes the low road, always veers towards scapegoating and xenophobia, spends tens of thousands of dollars on his bleach blonde hair as in his mid 70s, not to mention probably the hundreds of thousands of dollars he'll spend on his spray tans, and then claims, despite all that, to be, one of them. If they were to ever meet one of those people in real person, and it wasn't filtered through the propaganda channels of Fox News and right-wing talk radio, I think they would probably see through it too. But as it stands, he has a stranglehold on 40% of the population, and most of the Christians, unfortunately, as well. And that's just him as a person. Like I said, his policies are actually much worse than all of that. And so that's what I think about the election. Joe Biden is, no good, but he is a standard politician, and this other guy is something that I've used all the adjectives that I have for, but I think we should get rid of him.